vacation this week, and so John won't be here to give us the message this morning. This morning I'd like to talk to you about the story of a couple of occurrences in Jesus' life early on in his ministry. And so we'll look a little bit more at that in a moment. Well, again, thank you for all being here this morning. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, as I said, a couple of occasions early in Jesus' ministry. And to set the stage a little bit, I just wanted to kind of walk us through where was he and what was going on, and where did all this take place. To set the stage a little bit, because I think the story of this is not only interesting, but it's illuminating as well. And so this is early in Jesus' ministry. He had been up, one of the first big public occasions was the Sermon on the Mount, so-called Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus was up on a mountaintop, and in Matthew he devotes 3 chapters to sharing with us perhaps the longest collection of Jesus' words, but also many of the things that we think about that Jesus said that were so memorable and so shaking and so different to the context that he was in at that time, that people hadn't heard before, and made people think, this man is different. He speaks differently. A lot of those come from that Sermon on the Mount. So just following the Sermon on the Mount, which is along the Sea of Galilee, kind of, most believe that it's over here where you see the Mount of Beatitudes, kind of right up here, because the Sermon on the Mount starts with those Beatitudes, blessed are. And as he comes down off the mountain, he's making his way over here to Capernaum. And so he's somewhere kind of along that line, making his way down from the mountain down to Capernaum as the stories that, this couple of events that we're going to see take place. And so here's sort of a view from up on that mountain looking out towards Capernaum. He's headed down that way. And perhaps he's walking along a path that looks quite a bit like this. This is a picture of a path in the area, and he's making his way down, and there's a large crowd following him. And he's, again, just delivered these words that made people really sit up and listen. It was so different, so unique, that they hadn't heard people say things like Jesus was sharing with them, and it turned a lot of the things, a lot of the ideas that they had in their minds upside down. Like you've heard, love your neighbor. Well, I say love your enemies. It was kind of rocking to the world about, wait a minute, I get this idea of love my neighbor, but my enemies too? There were a lot of ideas like that he had just shared. And so he's making his way down from there. And he comes across a man somewhere along that path on his way to Capernaum that may have looked something like this, a man who was a leper. And I wanted to set the stage a little bit for what that meant. We have, in so many ways, with our modern medicine, we view disease, I think, perhaps a little bit differently. And there was a real fear, first of all, with somebody who was a leper. I want to just look for a moment here. This is from Leviticus. This is some of the instruction that the children of Israel were given about somebody who was a leper. Now, whosoever shall be defiled with leprosy and is separated by the judgment of the priest, so the priest says, yes, you have leprosy, shall have his clothes hanging loose, his head bare, his mouth covered with a cloth, and he shall cry out that he is defiled and unclean. All the time that he is a leper and unclean, he shall dwell alone without the camp. So this was an important disease to them at the time, important in the sense that, so first of all, imagine those people in your life. Think for a moment about everybody who you've got close in your life, your close friends, your family, perhaps your parents or your kids, your spouse, that you're no longer allowed to get within 6 feet of them. You can't come closer than 6 feet. You've got to live somewhere else. You've got to, first of all, move out of town. You've got to move into your own camp here of others with leprosy. You can't come closer than 6 feet. And if the wind is blowing that day, you can't come in within 150 feet of those you love. So you're separated from everybody. And everywhere you go, you've got to dress differently. You've got to have your clothes sort of disheveled, if you will, hanging loose. And you've got to cover your mouth. And you've got to go around yelling out, unclean, unclean, letting everybody know that they shouldn't come near you. This is the life of the man that he runs into on the road as he's making his way down from the Sermon on the Mount to Capernaum. and this big crowd's following them. And so can you imagine that scene? This is what these people knew, is that there's this disease. And let's add to that just a little bit. Here's some people who were struck with leprosy. You may or may not sort of recognize these names. There's Miriam, who was the sister of Moses. And Miriam, at one point along with Aaron, had started to basically contest the leadership of Moses, saying, hey, aren't we your leaders too? And so publicly standing up and saying, aren't we your leaders too? Why just Moses? So God calls Moses, Aaron, and Miriam out in front of the people, and Miriam's struck with leprosy. She's struck with this disease that we were just talking about that has all the, now he took it away as well. And then Uzzah, the king, is another example where Uzzah was one of the kings of Israel. He was started out this great king. He was doing all kinds of good things. He was doing exactly what God called him to do, and God was working through him powerfully to do that, and the boundaries of Israel were expanding. And in the midst of all that, he started thinking, hey, I am pretty good at this whole king thing. And in fact, I'm pretty important. I'm doing a lot of great things here. He got a real high view of himself all of a sudden. And so he went into the incense that only the priests were supposed to light, and decided he was going to lead this worship of God. Even though the priests were designated as the ones to do it, he went in and started lighting it too. And he got, guess what? Leprosy. For the rest of his life, he lived with this leprosy. And so one more example is Gehazi, who was a servant of Elisha. And you may remember the story of Naaman the leper, who comes to be healed of his leprosy with Elisha, and tries to, Naaman, who's this captain of the army of Syria?
Aram.
I'm sorry?
Aram.
Aram. So he's this important man. He comes with all his servants and his gifts. Thank you. And he tries to give them to Elisha, and Elisha is, not taking it. No, he didn't even come out to meet with Naaman. And so as Naaman's leaving with his entourage, Gehazi, Elisha's servant, chases off after him and says, wait a minute. My master had second thoughts on that, and he actually would like that stuff after all, and took the stuff for himself. And guess what happened? That's right, he got leprosy. So there's this physical aspect where people feared leprosy. It was something that they feared getting because of all the consequences, because it was deforming. It was a skin disease, and it just looked bad, it was painful, so they didn't want that. It was bad because of all the consequences. You had to move outside the camp. You couldn't be part of your society anymore in a lot of ways. And you had to go around and tell people you were unclean. And it was bad because it was generally perceived that it was a judgment of God. And partly because of stories like this, where you have these people who were struck by leprosy because they had done something that God was trying to publicly show his displeasure with what had just happened. And so there was this very big stigma with all that. So it's in the context of all that now that we come to this story in Matthew 8. So we're going to look at a couple of occasions in Matthew 8 and Matthew 9. A couple of short texts. But this one is when Jesus came down from the mountainside with large crowds followed him. So it's him coming down a path, maybe something like we just saw a picture of a moment ago, and he's got this big crowd following along with him. And a man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. So just stop for a moment there and try to picture this. Try to picture, he's got this big crowd, they're following him because he said some amazing things, and they're really dialed into him as this teacher, this great rabbi. So they're following them down the mountain, and they come to this leper who has the audacity to step out in front of them and kneel down and call out to him. I don't know about you, but I'm picturing this crowd kind of collective gasp as they see this man, and somebody's trying to, they're all probably thinking, somebody needs to move this man off the road, but, he's got leprosy, so I'm not going to go touch him. How do we get him out of the way? Because there's this great rabbi, and he's like approaching this rabbi. He's got leprosy. Doesn't he know he's supposed to just stay away? And I'm sure that was the reaction this big crowd's having. And in fact, other rabbis might have just sort of stepped back and it's like, somebody do something with him, so we can get by here. Because this was a dreaded disease. It was a despised disease in a lot of ways. Let's look, though, at what Jesus did. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. There's a bunch of things that strike me in this story, just these 3 verses here already. And I suppose I should probably be most taken by the fact that this man, Son of God, who came to live among us, just spoke to a man and this disease went away. In fact, following this in Matthew 8, there's a whole bunch of other stories of other people being healed of different diseases. And Jesus is able to just speak and the diseases go away. These dread diseases that I have lived with a lifetime, perhaps. And so that should be perhaps the thing that really jumps out at me, and it does in a way, but I am almost more struck in some way by the fact that Jesus, his first reaction is he reaches out and touches his friend. That was something you just did not do. You didn't touch a leper. You wouldn't go out of your way to reach out and touch a man like this. And Jesus, his first reaction is he reaches out and touches him. And I'm struck also by the fact that he touches him and then he says, be healed. It's not like he said, okay, I want you to be clean, be healed. He's healed, and it's like, okay, can you turn around for me, check the fingernails, make sure you're clean. Okay, now let me give you a little hug here, and we'll celebrate the moment. His first reaction is he reaches out and touches this man that the crowd must have gasped at that. If they didn't gasp aloud at first just because the lepers showed up, I imagine they had to have gasped as they see Jesus reach out and touch him. That's our God. That's our God. He reaches out and touches us with a compassion and a mercy that astounds us, that astounded this crowd, I'm sure, at the time. He first reaches out to the man and touches him, and then he heals him. I also want to just step into another part here for a moment. I want to share with you about, I've been reading this, recently I read a book, and you'll probably think this is funny, this guy reads this kind of stuff. It's about the psychology of disgust and contamination. It was fascinating. It's a little bit different book. But at any rate, so I was reading about this idea of contamination and disgust and contempt, the feelings that go along with sort of the contamination and our reactions to that. And I'll tie this all back together here in a moment, but I think that maybe is already evident how some of this relates to the idea of leprosy. So some of the principles of contagion. Paul Rosen is one of the foremost experts on contagions and discuss the reactions to it. And he has 4 principles of contagion. One, that generally by contact. So contagious things are things that we somehow come in contact with. And so this idea that Jesus is walking along the road, encounters this leper and reaches out and touches him, that goes against the grain, this idea of contagion, this horrible disease. And so it's spread by contact, and that we often sort of, so some of these ideas, principles of contagion, are both scientific, and a lot of them are sort of focusing on, again, this is an expert on disgust, so our reaction to the ideas of contagion. So some basis in science, a lot of it based in our psychology, because remember this is a book about the psychology of contamination and disgust. Dose and sensitivity. So to illustrate this, he in the book talked about a study where the social scientists had Dixie cups. And he had people spit into their Dixie cups. Already, kind of like, ooh, that's kind of weird. And then he asked them to drink what they just spit into the cup. And I can see some of the faces here. Yeah, the telltale signs of like that's disgusting. The wrinkled noses, the kind of cocked look a little bit. So he asked them to drink that, and you think about these ideas of, and I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to come back to the Dixie cup, but we also think about the idea of like the waiter, there's a fly in my soup. So if there's like a fly in your soup, you get sort of that same reaction. Who wants to have that, right? And there's a little bit of dose and intensity, because even if you have a big bowl of soup and one little fly that lands in it, are you guys eager to just sort of scoop out the fly and dig in? Most of us have the reaction of, wait a minute, there's a fly in my soup, please take that away and bring me a new soup, right? It doesn't really matter that the fly is little and the soup is big. There's a fly in my soup, I don't want that soup. And once you scoop out that fly, you still don't want the soup. There's a permanence about it. The fly is no longer in that soup, so what do you care at that point? Well, there's a permanence about that sort of sense of contamination. That it comes in contact with this fly landing in your soup, that it doesn't matter that the fly is little and that it stays that way. And it's interesting because in general our sense of contamination is this negative dominance. That a little fly and a little bit of bad dominates the impure, dominates the pure, that soup that maybe you were looking forward to. And it's not that that big bowl of soup makes the fly pure in our thinking. It's that the fly, a little fly, makes the big bowl of soup impure. It stays that way. Again, it doesn't matter sort of the matter of dose, but it's permanent. And we have this sense of contamination kind of working that way. And then our reaction to that those notions of contamination are our ideas of disgust. So what happens when you've got that bowl of soup and you're digging in, you've got it just at your lips, and then you see the fly? You know, right? You spit it out. And if you maybe just took a couple of bites and then you look down and you see the fly, you start, you know, right? We start gagging and having this reaction. This idea of disgust is a border psychology, boundary psychology. We don't want to keep things that are not pure out. That fly in the soup that the fly was in, any of that, any of those impurities, we want it out. We don't want to put it in to begin with. If it's in, we start gagging because we want it out. It's expulsive. We want to get the impurities out of our life. So it's expulsive. We want to get it away from us. And it's interesting because these ideas are promiscuous. That is, we tend to apply it to a lot of different contexts. Our disgust can kind of apply to the soup, it can apply to the bowl. We just sort of spread that sense of how we apply these reactions to contaminations in our life in some fashion. And there's a real healthiness about all of this as it relates to things like disease and food, right? Because it's something that God puts within us to keep us from eating poisonous stuff or stuff that's going to make us sick, or we have a reaction of disgust to get it out, to not have it be part of us. There's an interesting part, though, that's, I think, magical about it as well, which is there's a bit of it that's just psychology, because talking about that Dixie cup earlier, nobody wants to, you know, sort of have a drink from that cup again. Once we have it out, we don't want it back in. It's that idea of a boundary psychology. By the way, that spitting into the cup, it was in our mouth a moment ago, right? And nobody thought twice about it. We spit it into the cup, and now it's out. It's not part of us. And we don't want to put it back in. It just came out of our mouths, but we don't want to put it back in. It's a boundary psychology again. Once it's out, we want to keep it down. So this magical idea is that, let's say that we all had these Dixie cups, and or maybe just one of the Dixie cups, and there was a bunch of them up here with something to drink in it. And I took that one that somebody had spit into, and I cleaned it really good. I sanitized it. You saw me sanitize it in a really thorough way and believe, oh, we got it clean. And then I put it back down here and I poured some of the same beverage in it and said, okay, everybody come up and get one. How long do you think the one that somebody spat into would sit there? It may be the cleanest one out there. You just saw me sanitize it. But nobody wants to pick up the one that somebody spat into. There's a magical sort of quality to our sense of disgust. And it doesn't always follow logic. Because if you were just being purely logical about it, you might say, well, I don't know about any of those other cups. They may not be clean. I saw them sanitize that one. So the logical answer is, I want that cup. But that's not any of our reaction. Our reaction is, I don't want that cup because it's been contaminated. It's permanent. It's dose insensitive. It's gone bad. I don't want it. That's a little bit of how we tend to view a lot of things in our lives. And then when it relates to food and contamination of things that we might take into our body that would make it sick, that makes great sense. God made us to have these reactions to contamination, to get it out, and not for us not to get sick. The problem gets to be, though, that back to the idea of it's promiscuous, we apply it to a great number of things. And I want to look at another occasion that followed shortly after the one we just were looking at about the leper. So people's reaction to the leper and Jesus touching him, there's a piece of that you say, well, that kind of makes sense. The guy's a leper. Does Jesus want to get sick? Come back to that idea in a moment, but that there's a part of that as a leper makes sense. But I want to look at another occasion that follows in chapter 9. Probably a text that many are familiar with. So just one chapter later, Jesus is now down in Capernaum, and he's just called Matthew, who was a tax collector. He's passing by as he's going down the street in Capernaum. He passes by Matthew at his tax collection booth and says to him, "Follow me." And Matthew just gets up and follows him and becomes one of the 12. But right after that, it says, while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And you see the same look of disgust as that notion of drinking the contents of the Dixie cup. They're having that same look on their face. Their noses are kind of wrinkled. They kind of have that curled up lip a little bit as they say, "Why does your teacher eat with these tax collectors and sinners?" The same thing's going on here. And hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." So it's a kind of an interesting text that Jesus again is just like when he reached out and touched that leper. Now he's sitting down with people that many in Capernaum are thinking, why in the world would you get close to those people? You might catch something. And they may not be thinking you're going to catch a disease, but you're going to catch something from them. They're impure. They're not right. They're contaminated in some fashion. And as we just saw, we have these notions of contamination as sort of for always, and it doesn't matter how much. But Jesus is sitting down with these tax collectors and sinners and eating with them, of all things. He's sitting and eating with them. What a reaction this crowd had. And I think it's interesting, though, Jesus' reaction, just as he was confronted with this leper who came and asked for his help on the roadway, and he reached out and touched him. He sees these people who are hurting, these tax collectors and sinners, as they're referred to here. And he reacts to them in the very same way. He has the same reaction that reaching out and touching the leper. He sits down and has a meal with these people that are eschewed by their society. In a very similar way to how the leper was eschewed. Maybe they didn't have to move outside the camp, but they weren't part of their society in a lot of ways. And I think it's interesting that Jesus quotes from Hosea 6:6 when he says, "I want you to go figure out what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice." And that's a little bit of a head scratcher at some level, because wasn't it God who commanded all these sacrifices? I mean, if you read through Leviticus, it's even around this subject of leprosy, if somebody is healed from leprosy, there's all these sort of sets of sacrifices that they need to do. God commanded a pretty complex set of different sacrifices that the people were supposed to offer. And so when Jesus quotes Hosea and says, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice," go and figure out what that means. That's kind of what I hope we do today, is we go and we learn, what does it mean? I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And so hopefully, as we kind of explore a little bit more through these, they begin to illuminate a little bit of maybe part of what he means by this, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Because he definitely commanded the sacrifice. So when he says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, I don't think he's saying, I don't want you to sacrifice, because he commanded them to do it. It maybe is akin to another occasion where Jesus said, unless you hate your mother and your father and your sister and your brother, you can't be my disciple. And he's drawing a contrast there between the way that you feel about him, following him, and the way that you feel about your own family. And so I think similarly, perhaps he's drawing a contrast, but he doesn't say, I desire mercy and sacrifice, or I desire mercy with your sacrifice. He puts it in the strongest terms that he can. He says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And something that's happening here in the context of his dinner with these publicans and sinners makes him, and then the reaction of the Pharisees, something in that makes him say this. So is there any sacrifice you see in this text? Were they offering up doves or rams or bulls or drink offerings? Or no, they're sitting having dinner. The Pharisees come up and say, why are you eating with them? They don't deserve your social interaction. Why are you eating with them? You're going to get contaminated by these people. Why are you eating with them? So it's interesting. Somehow Jesus is making a connection between this notion of sacrifice and what's going on there. And it's not an overt, I don't want you to make the sacrifices that have been commanded in the law. But it's about our attitude of what we are sacrificing, perhaps, I think, at some level as well. I wanted to look a little bit, here's a little bit out of that book that I referenced earlier. It's called Unclean, the Psychology of Disgust and Contamination. And in it, there's this quote that this dynamic, purity via expulsion. So again, this idea of purity via expulsion, the lepers were kicked out of the camp and they weren't supposed to live in town. They were supposed to go live off by themselves, unclean, make sure that they're separate. So they were expelled from the society. And in the mind of the Pharisees who approached Jesus as disciples, these tax collectors and sinners were expelled from the society. They may have lived in town, but they were not part of that society in the same way. They were expelled from being part of that society. So this dynamic of purity via expulsion goes to the heart of the problem in Matthew 9. The Pharisees attain their purity through an expulsive mechanism, expelling tax collectors and sinners, the contaminant, expelling them from the life of Israel. Jesus rejects this form of holiness. Jesus, citing mercy as his rule, refuses to sacrifice these people to become clean. So I think perhaps part of this, I thought this well stated, this notion of sacrifice. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, but there weren't any sacrifices going on, right? Well, they were trying to make a sacrifice. They were trying to sacrifice the contaminant and expel it from the life of Israel. And Jesus rejected that notion. He rejected the idea that there were disposable people who should be rejected and sacrificed for the purpose of purity. Now, he's not saying don't be pure. You see that in so many other ways. But he rejects the idea of sacrificing people to gain our own purity. Do you remember that idea of, that we talked about a moment ago about contamination, that negative dominance, that one little fly in a bowl of soup, it's a big bowl of soup, but it's all made bad by the negative, by the contaminant, by that fly. Jesus flips all of that. And we see that in both of these occasions here. So Jesus approaches the leper, and he doesn't first heal him and then reach out to him. He first reaches out to him and then heals him. Jesus is the exception to that notion of negative dominance. And we grew up with stories of evil companions corrupt good morals, right? I mean, that's biblical. But we kind of grew up with this notion that we need to extract ourselves from all these contaminants to maintain our purity. And Jesus kind of flips all of that around. He's sitting down with tax collectors and sinners. And I think part of the takeaway for me in this, and I want to sort of throw out there for you guys to consider, is that Jesus becomes positive dominance. That when Jesus is there, the impure become pure. The sick become well. The broken become healed. That Jesus is positive dominance. And wherever Jesus goes, whether he's reaching out to a leper or sitting down at a meal with tax collectors and sinners, he, the positive, dominates the negative. He heals the sick. He heals the broken hearts. in every context we see Jesus walking into, he becomes the dominant, not the negative. And so what is different about this idea of evil companions corrupt good morals and kind of, that idea of expulsion, the negative out, the thing that we kind of quick, in fact, I think, to be critical of these Pharisees. How can you be eating with those people? They're trying to maintain the purity. They're trying to not corrupt good morals. They're trying to be pure. They're expelling that negative, dominant contaminant. But what's different now, what's different with us, is if we're going with Jesus, we're going with that positive dominance. If we're walking with him, we're walking with the one who makes the impure pure. We're walking with the one that makes the broken fixed. We can walk into places that maybe on our own we cannot. Because when we're going with him, he makes pure. His mission on this world was to seek those who were sick, not the righteous. Or the sick, not those who are well. Sorry, mixing my metaphors there that he used. His mission is to redeem this world to himself, to heal the broken, to purify the impure. And he's calling us to be part of that. So what does he mean when he says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice? If our notion of purity is that we need to build fences and sort of keep the club legitimate, to keep our gathering pure, we're missing what Jesus was doing. We're missing what he calls us to do, to have mercy, to not sacrifice people in the process. So this church, I think in particular, is quite good about accepting people where they are and helping each other get where God wants us to be. That used to be the banner that was hanging up here for some years. And I think the church actually practices that. But how many ways do you have sort of this list of people in your own mind, and maybe not really in a cognitive sense, who at some level you have that contaminated reaction to? I don't know what it is for you. It'll be different for you than it is for me, perhaps. But I think at some level we all sort of have, at some subconscious level even perhaps, that reaction to people. And God calls us to not sacrifice people, any people. Not the tax collectors and sinners, not the lepers, to sacrifice any people in our sort of quest for purity. He wants us to be pure. He wants to purify this world and make the impure pure. And he wants to do that. He wants to change us. He wants to change those who are around us. And he wants to change those who he puts in our lives. That maybe we have a tendency to sort of pull back from, to expel from our lives in some fashion. So I want to sort of challenge you to think about this week. Who is it that falls into that category for you? Who is it that you have some just first reaction is withdrawal? I want to challenge you to have a first reaction with everybody that precedes any sense of observation or notion. The first reaction is a position of willingness to embrace, that you bring them into your life. As Jesus reaches out to the leper as he sits down to eat with the tax collectors and sinners, that we have that same will to embrace those who come into our lives. And that none of the people become the sacrifice for our own sense of purity. I think that I wanted to talk about this morning because John has finished this great series on next generation and why the next generation is leading the church. And I hear echoes in my mind, at least, of that whole series in this couple of occasions of Jesus' life. That a lot of perhaps why the next generation, if you're thinking about the exclusion, I think is one of the 6 that John talked about, shallowness, the different things that the next generation looks at the church in America and says, I don't want to be part of that. Because too often we look like the Pharisees questioning Jesus about why are you eating with those tax collectors and sinners? We look too often like that crowd following Jesus who gasped when Jesus reached out to touch the leper. He calls us to mercy, not sacrifice. So that's sort of my challenge this week that I want to throw out there for you to think about is who is it that I have that reaction to? And how might I change my reaction to always be a position of embrace, bring people into my life rather than maintain our boundaries and push people out. Andy, would you please sing the song?